Hey guys! Tonight, we're slipping into a smoky great hall, lit only by torches and tension. You're standing at the edge of a long feasting table in medieval Europe, Bohemia. To be exact, and the king is dead. The roasted boar still steams. The minstrels have fallen quiet. And all eyes turn not to the heavens, but to the empty chair where a crown rests awkwardly, like it knows the chaos it's about to unleash. This isn't a normal succession. There's no clear heir. No. Peaceful plan. Just a room full of nervous nobles, opportunistic bishops, and messengers already galloping through sleet-soaked forests to spread the news. A new war of succession is brewing not just for a throne, but for the soul of Central Europe. And if you think you'd survive 5 minutes in this royal shark tank without getting dismembered by protocol or poisoned by wine, well, bless your confidence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You inch closer to the royal dais. The Bohemian king Ottokar II has just died in battle. A man of ambition and iron. He'd carved out an empire that reached from Prague to the Adriatic. But ambition makes enemies. And his rivals? Especially the rising Habsburgs of Austria. Never forgave him for treating their duchy like an afterthought. With Ottokar gone, everything's up for grabs. His only heir is a minor. His alliance is frayed. Bohemia's nobles, once united behind a strong hand, now eye each other like wolves in church robes. There's a sense that whoever grabs this crown next might remake the region or destroy it entirely. Enter the Habsburgs. Relatively new on the European scene. Originally, Swiss counts. They'd only recently snatched the Duchy of Austria after a mix of battlefield luck and imperial favor. Their leader, Rudolf of Habsburg, had just been elected King of the Romans, basically. The top job in the Holy Roman Empire, thanks to being the least objectionable candidate. Seriously, the other electors couldn't agree on anyone else. So they settled on him, like you'd settle on a middle-seat airline ticket. Now Rudolf has a shot at reshaping the imperial map, and he's got his sights on Bohemia. But not so fast, because on the other side stands the House of Wittelsbach, a powerful Bavarian dynasty with old money, papal friends, and a tendency to settle disputes with swords. They consider Bohemia part of their sphere. More than that, they resent the Habsburgs. And in the stew of dynastic politics, resentment is a very reliable fuel. What's at stake isn't just Bohemia. It's legitimacy, influence, control of imperial elections, access to trade routes, silver mines, and that ever so important shiny thing, the Bohemian crown. You listen. As the nobles of Bohemia whisper in corners, they're torn. Some prefer stability. Others want autonomy. A few just want revenge for old insults. Many fear foreign rule, whether Habsburg or Wittelsbach, and dream of elevating one of their own. Spoiler, that won't go well. Meanwhile, Rudolf of Habsburg isn't waiting. He launches a campaign not with armies yet, but with letters, promises, bribes. A bishop or two changes sides. A baron swears allegiance in exchange for land. The chessboard is in motion. But here's the kicker. Succession in medieval Bohemia isn't automatic. It's elective. The nobility choose their king, which means every handshake, every toast, every smirk across a banquet table is a move in a bloodless war. Well, bloodless for now. Historians still argue whether Rudolph's early maneuvers were legal diplomacy or thinly veiled threats, but what's clear is this. He plays the long game. While others plot coups, he builds consensus. While others threaten war, he offers marriage alliances. One quirky moment, Rudolph allegedly sent barrels of Hungarian wine and embroidered cloaks to a dozen Bohemian magnates, then waited within months. 5 of them were singing his praises in the cathedral choir. You exhale, the feast is over. The king is still dead, but the board is set. In the shadows of cathedrals and counting houses, a new kind of war begins. The war for Bohemia's crown. You rise early with the frost still clinging to the church roofs of Prague. Somewhere in the distance, bells toll, not for prayer, but for politics. The throne of Bohemia, freshly vacant, has turned into a magnet for ambition. Every duke with a half-decent bloodline and a sword sharp enough to impress the neighbors is suddenly interested. And the Wittelsbachs, they're already writing speeches as if the crown were theirs yesterday. You pass through the royal castle gates and feel the tension in the air. Bohemia isn't just a prize, it's the prize. A kingdom with silver mines, rich farmlands, powerful clergy, and perhaps most dangerously, a tradition of electing its kings, not inheriting, not conquering, electing, which makes it a political tinderbox with a golden fuse. Enter the Wittelsbachs, from their seat in Bavaria. They've always looked eastward with a mixture of admiration and envy. The family isn't just powerful, they're seasoned. They've intermarried with German nobility, fought in crusades, and hosted more than a few popes for dinner. When Ottokar II dies, they see their chance. With no strong successor, Bohemia is ripe for persuasion or pressure. The Wittelsbach patriarch at this time is Duke Louis II. And he's no lightweight. He's shrewd, respected, and well connected in the imperial court. He starts sending envoys to Prague, promising protection, order, and respect for Bohemian customs. Translation: vote for me, and I won't burn your estates. You attend one of the informal meetings between Louis's agents and Bohemian nobles. The tone is friendly, the message clear. Support Wittelsbach influence, and you'll share in power. Resist, and, well, you might find your cellars unusually flammable this winter. Meanwhile, Rudolf of Habsburg is playing a quieter game. He's less charismatic than the Wittelsbachs, but more focused. He doesn't just want Bohemia, he wants legitimacy, empire, control of the imperial elections. So Rudolf starts working the angles. He courts bishops. He reminds nobles of old favors. He offers safe passage for merchants, tax reductions, and when needed, bribes disguised as royal investments. Historians still argue whether Rudolf's approach was pragmatic genius or desperate manipulation, but you can feel it. He understands something: fundamental power doesn't come from crowns. It comes from consent, or the illusion of it. One quirky detail: Bohemian nobles during this period loved contracts. Everything was written down. When one minor noble switched sides mid-meeting, the first thing he did was scribble a new loyalty pact and stamp it with his personal wax seal. The second thing, ask for wine. As the weeks drag on, the city splits into camps. The Wittelsbach faction leans westward, backed by Bavarian clout and religious conservatism. The Habsburg faction leans eastward, drawing strength from imperial connections and promises of economic growth. And in the middle, a nervous cluster of nobles praying this doesn't turn into a civil war. Eventually, the Bohemian Diet convenes. It's part parliament, part ritual, part theatrical cage match. The nobles gather in ceremonial dress, and the speeches begin. They debate, they stall, they insult each other in extremely polite Latin. At one point, a bishop throws his ring at a baron's feet and accuses him of heresy over a land grant dispute. The choice is clear: the crown will go either to the Wittelsbach-backed candidate or to someone more pliable who will take orders from the Habsburgs, and then a third faction emerges. Some nobles want a native Bohemian prince, someone from inside their own ranks, someone who won't owe favors to Austria or Bavaria. It sounds noble. It's also wildly impractical. No native candidate has the support or military strength to hold the throne for long. But the idea sticks. Independence. Identity. Bohemia for Bohemians. You feel the ground shift. The Wittelsbachs up their pressure. Their envoys speak in sterner tones. Soldiers appear along the border for protection. The message is no longer subtle. Meanwhile, Rudolf sends a quiet but powerful signal. He's willing to wait. Let the Bohemians fight among themselves. Let the Wittelsbachs overplay their hand. Then he'll walk in. Not as a conqueror, but as a savior. The crown still sits in the royal vault. Untouched. Gleaming. You imagine it whispering, "Pick me." But choose carefully. You step into the flickering candlelight of a monastery just outside Vienna, where a small group of armored men is kneeling, not to pray, but to plot. The smell of damp stone and parchment hangs in the air. These are Habsburg loyalists. And they're not just discussing God. They're talking about Bohemia, back in Austria. Rudolf of Habsburg is gathering strength not just in soldiers or silver, but in strategy. The Wittelsbachs are still pushing hard for the Bohemian crown, flexing their alliances and occasionally letting armed escorts show up uninvited at diplomatic meetings. But Rudolf, he's patient and dangerous. You sit with him as he pores over maps and noble family trees. His plan isn't a swift military strike. It's dynastic. Slow burn. The first move, strengthen Austria. After securing the duchy from the late Ottokar II, Rudolf has spent the past few years turning it into a legitimate power base. He brings order to the local administration, settles land disputes, and most importantly, gets the church on his side. A bishop with a good sermon is worth 5 knights in armor. Then comes Bohemian outreach. Rudolf isn't just writing letters to nobles anymore. He's offering marriages, strategic ones. Wouldn't your daughter look nice beside my nephew? Don't you think our houses share a blessed future? It sounds romantic. It's a hostile takeover in silk gloves. One particularly clever move, he arranges for one of his daughters to be betrothed to a Bohemian noble's son before the election is finalized. No official alliance, just a friendly promise. But the implications... huge. Historians still argue whether Rudolf's mastery of marriage diplomacy came from genuine vision, or if he simply understood that in the Holy Roman Empire, bedchambers are boardrooms. Meanwhile, the Wittelsbachs are growing impatient. Louis of Bavaria pushes harder. He warns of Habsburg overreach. He whispers to the Pope, He even begins drawing up military provisions just in case negotiations break down. But the real chess piece lands when a Bohemian prince, once sympathetic to the Wittelsbachs, switches sides. Why? A combination of tax relief, promised lands, and, rumor has it, a falcon gifted directly by Rudolf. Not a metaphor, a real falcon. White feathers, golden bells, nobles. Love that stuff. In Prague, you can feel the tension snapping like overdrawn bowstrings. The royal vault still holds the crown, but everyone knows it's just a matter of time. And then the trigger comes. A border incident. Small? Stupid. Probably avoidable. A group of Bavarian knights pursuing bandits crosses into Bohemian territory. Bohemian guards respond. There's a skirmish. 3 men dead. 1 captured. It's enough. The Wittelsbachs demand justice. The Bohemians stall. The Habsburgs condemn the incursion and quietly offer support to defend Bohemian sovereignty. You're there when the Bohemian Diet reconvenes. More shouting. More finger-pointing. More suspicious wine-pouring. And then comes the twist. A new candidate emerges. Not a Wittelsbach, not a native Bohemian, but a puppet of the Habsburgs, someone with a decent claim and no real power base, a placeholder, a gateway. And the nobles. They go for it. Better to crown someone weak and local than risk Bavaria's heavy boots on Prague's cobblestones. Rudolf doesn't cheer. He doesn't even smile. He just closes the letter, informing him of the vote, and quietly orders a set of royal gifts to be sent to Prague. Silk, silver, and, of course, more wine. You leave the monastery behind as the bells ring across Central Europe, not for peace, but for the illusion of it. You ride south now, across the fog-drenched borderlands between Bohemia and Bavaria, the air thick with autumn wood smoke and horse sweat. Behind you, Prague simmers under its newly installed Habsburgläset King. Ahead Bavaria, and the Wittelsbachs, who are not taking this turn of events. Well, inside a tall stone tower in Munich, Duke Louis II of Bavaria grips a goblet too tightly. His knuckles go white. The Bohemian nobles, whom he'd practically bathed in gold, have voted against his candidate. Worse, they voted with Rudolf. This isn't just a lost election. It's a humiliation. You sit beside Louis at council, where his advisors scramble to decide what's next. One recommends military force. Another proposes bribing more Bohemian lords. A third suggests making a public appeal to the Pope. Let's paint the Habsburgs as heretical meddlers. He says. The room fills with overlapping outrage and strategies, and then Louis makes a decision that will shape the next decade he's going to escalate. He begins raising forces. Not a full-scale army. Not yet. But border reinforcements. He publicly accuses Rudolf of manipulating the Bohemian election. Privately, he sends envoys to sympathetic nobles, promising better rewards if they switch sides. And through it all, he positions the Wittelsbachs not as aggressors, but as defenders of order. It's clever, calculated, and deeply dangerous. You pass through towns where Bavarian troops drill in open squares, where markets buzz with rumors of war, where bishops write cautious letters warning of growing unrest among the lay elite. You even hear a monk joke. By the time we get a real king, we'll all be buried in consecrated mud. Rudolf sees it too. The tension, the potential for war. But he refuses to blink. Instead, he doubles down on ceremony. He parades through Austria with crowned reliquaries, holds public masses for peace, distributes coins featuring his face and the phrase Dei Gratia Romanorum Rex, by the grace of God. King of the Romans. It's a flex, wrapped in piety. One fringe tidbit: Rudolf commissions a massive genealogical tapestry tracing his Habsburg lineage back to Julius Caesar. Totally fabricated. Totally effective. Meanwhile, Bohemia is split. Again, some nobles feel buyer's remorse. The new king is weak, indecisive, and clearly a Habsburg puppet. Others worry Bavaria might invade. Others still grumble that maybe they should have crowned a local after all. One noble famously suggests electing a bishop instead of a king. The room reportedly went silent for a full minute. Historians still argue whether Louis genuinely planned to invade Bohemia or just wanted to scare the nobles into flipping. But as Wittelsbach banners start appearing near the border, one thing becomes clear: no one is backing down. A diplomatic delegation is formed. Rudolf sends a team of envoys to meet with Wittelsbach representatives in Regensburg. The goal? Cool the flames. Instead, it turns into a shouting match. One Bavarian calls the Habsburgs sheep in priests' robes. A Habsburg envoy responds by accusing Louis of spitting on the bones of Charlemagne. By the end of the meeting, one man has been ejected, and the talks collapse completely. You return to Vienna with the delegation. The moment they cross the threshold of the Hofburg Palace, the guards know it's war in all but name. And in the halls of Bavaria, Louis finishes dictating a letter not to Rudolf, but to other imperial electors, questioning Rudolf's right to even hold the imperial crown. It's a move so bold, it nearly lights the empire on fire. And you stand in the crackling center of a feud that has moved beyond thrones into the fragile bones of the Holy Roman Empire itself. You sit in the back row of a cathedral packed with velvet and ego. Every noble in Bohemia is here, squeezed into narrow pews with crowns etched into the wood, pretending not to side-eye each other while a bishop clears his throat at the front. This isn't a coronation. It's a game of election roulette, and no one knows how the dice will fall. You'd think a kingdom would have a line of succession as neat as a family tree. Not Bohemia. Here, the monarchy is elective. The nobles choose their king, and with Ottokar II dead, the throne is just sitting there, shiny, unclaimed, glowing with political radiation. Each candidate circles like a hawk. The Wittelsbachs pitch their man as a defender of noble rights. Read, we'll let you keep your castles. The Habsburgs argue for imperial unity. Translation, do what we say, and we won't tax your wine. A third camp, minor nobles, wants a local Bohemian prince. Charming, powerless, pliable. In the shadows, bribes are exchanged. Gifts, technically, velvet cloaks, silver dayas. Estates, one noble gets a chest of saffron and 3 horses. Another A promised that his son will marry into Austrian nobility. You catch a whisper about one baron who sold his vote for a new roof and a position in the royal pantry. The bishop begins reading the candidates' names. There's tension in every syllable. And then, a tie. Votes are deadlocked. Fists clench on sword hilts. One elector faints, possibly from the heat. More likely from fear. The hall descends into murmurs. And then, twist. A relatively unknown Bohemian noble stands up and proposes a compromise. King someone no one loves, but everyone can tolerate. The nobles groan, then pause, then begin to nod. It's not a solution, it's a delay. But Bohemia accepts it. And the real war, it's now behind the throne. You walk the stone corridor of Prague Castle as bells toll across the city. A new king has been crowned. But don't let the trumpets fool you. This coronation comes with caveats. The new ruler is more puppet than prince, chosen not for power or pedigree, but because he offends the fewest factions. The Wittelsbachs seethe in their estates. The Habsburgs smile a little too hard. The Bohemian nobles, they breathe just a bit, knowing the new king won't meddle too much with their privileges. You stand near the altar as the bishop places the crown gently on the king's head. There's no thunder, no prophecy, just awkward clapping, and a faint sense that this isn't going to last. Behind the scenes, the real rulers move. Habsburg envoys begin visiting regional governors, offering advice. One even rewrites a section of tax law as a favor. The Wittelsbachs respond by sending a delegation to Rome, asking the Pope to formally denounce Rudolph's growing influence. The Pope doesn't respond. He's busy fencing with the French. Meanwhile, peasants continue planting barley. Nobles throw tournaments. And somewhere in the background, the empire shudders because the imperial crown itself is now contested. Louis of Bavaria isn't just annoyed, he's angry. He accuses Rudolph of undermining the entire electoral process, suggesting that if kings can be propped up with coin and quiet threats, then the Holy Roman Empire is no longer sacred. It's a marketplace. One fringe moment. A band of minstrels in Regensburg writes a satirical song called "The Crown That Slipped," mocking the Bohemian process with rhymed insults. It spreads fast. Historians still argue whether this coronation diffused tension or deepened it. You feel it in the cold castle corridors. The walls echo with more than ceremony. They whisper plots. This isn't peace. It's a pause. You're seated on a wooden bench in the Chamber of Electors as ink is poured onto parchment like a priest blessing a battlefield. The year is 1356. And the Emperor Charles IV, a Bohemian king turned imperial architect, is issuing the Golden Bull. No, it's not livestock. It's law. Big law. The Golden Bull of 1356 is Charles IV's masterstroke. A document meant to clean up the imperial election process and solidify the powers of the Holy Roman Empire's most elite players. 7 electors, 3 archbishops, and 4 secular princes now officially decide who becomes emperor. Bohemia, one of those 7. You feel the ripple effect immediately. The Habsburgs are furious. They've been edged out. The Wittelsbachs fume less for exclusion, more for being pinned by rules they can no longer bend. And Charles, he just smiles, because he's rigged the game while pretending to codify it. The bull reinforces the idea that Bohemia matters, that its king isn't just a local ruler, but an imperial kingmaker. And with Charles sitting on both thrones, Bohemia and the Empire, he cemented a dual legacy. One quirky clause. The document requires electors to live in specific cities and bans private warfare between them. Does it work? Not even for a decade. Still, it's revolutionary. Charles IV starts building Prague into an imperial capital cathedrals. Universities? Bridges. One joke claims he spent more on stone than on soldiers. His sponsor, Charles University. The first in Central Europe, Bohemia isn't just powerful, it's cultural. But all this glory comes at a cost. The Wittelsbachs lose ground, the Habsburgs regroup, and the nobles of Bohemia begin to whisper that their king is spending too much time thinking like an emperor and not enough like a Czech. Historians still argue whether the Golden Bull created imperial stability or calcified elite control. You watch the ink dry and wonder in a game with new rules. Who cheats first? You stand on a sun-drenched balcony in Prague, watching construction cranes hoist stone above a city that smells like incense and ambition. Down in the courtyard, men in velvet coats debate theology, while over your shoulder, Charles IV quietly reshapes the world. He's no warrior. Not really. His sword is law. His battlefield is paperwork. Charles IV, King of Bohemia, Holy Roman Emperor, and architect of Prague's golden age, is doing what few rulers dare thinking long-term. He commissions bridges, fortifications, and Charles University, which instantly becomes a magnet for thinkers, clerics, and angry students. He launches legal reforms, codifies rights, centralizes administration. The empire is still chaotic, but now it's organized chaos, with Charles holding the ruler and square. And while he's building, he's also undermining the Wittelsbachs. Louis of Bavaria watches helplessly as Charles courts their allies one by one, offering land, titles, and positions in imperial offices. It's not war, it's erasure. One clever move: Charles elevates Prague's status as an imperial city, drawing prestige and resources away from the Wittelsbach strongholds like Munich. He even shifts imperial diets closer to Bohemia. It's like moving the capital without officially moving it. The Wittelsbachs protest loudly, but Charles IV's hold on power is too strong. And he has something they don't: Bohemian legitimacy. He's born there, crowned there, loved there. Kind of. You see, some nobles are starting to grumble. Charles, while brilliant, is distant. He speaks fluent Latin and French, but occasionally stumbles in Czech. His policies prioritize imperial unity over Bohemian autonomy. A few barons start gathering in private to discuss traditional liberties. Historians still argue whether Charles was more Bohemian or Roman. But one thing's clear: he's the first to use Bohemia not just as a kingdom, but as an imperial base of operations. And that, you realize, changes everything. You duck under a storm-lashed archway in Vienna, watching a line of merchants curse as their wagons are inspected by a dozen overly zealous guards. The city smells like wet wool and fresh paranoia. Why? Because the Habsburgs are rebuilding. Back in Austria. The fall of Ottokar and the rise of Charles IV have left the Habsburgs bruised but not broken. They've lost Bohemia. They've lost imperial favor. But what they still have: Austria, and Austria, while a little muddy, is fertile ground for revenge. You sit beside Duke Albert II, Rudolph's son. He doesn't speak much, but when he does, it's sharp and measured. His strategy isn't blitzkrieg, it's reinforcement. Slowly, methodically, the Habsburgs start building their power base. They reorganize tax collection. They strengthen local militias. They appoint loyalists to church positions. Every monastery becomes a vault. Every city, potentielle forteresse. One quirky moment, a Habsburg official introduces a policy of weighing bread at markets to ensure fair prices. It's wildly unpopular with bakers, widely beloved by peasants, and cleverly used as PR. Meanwhile, the Wittelsbachs have overextended. They hold Bavaria. Yes, but their attempts to undermine Charles IV are backfiring. Some of their nobles defect to the Habsburgs. Others grow restless with Louis's relentless obsession with regaining lost crowns. The Bohemian nobles watch all this from a distance. They don't trust Charles fully. They certainly don't trust the Wittelsbachs. But the Habsburgs, now that's an unknown they're willing to explore again. And so the secret messages begin. Viennese riders carry velvet-wrapped scrolls into Bohemian forests. Pledges of non-aggression. Offers of trade. Hints of alliance. Historians still debate if this was Albert's plan or a natural drift in political winds. But it works. The Habsburgs are regrouped. And Bohemia is suddenly watching them again. You lean against the cold stone wall of a cloister, listening to two abbots argue over something much bigger than theology inheritance. The church claims divine right. The princes claim blood. And the Habsburgs, they claim both, depending on who they're talking to. It's the 1360s. And dynastic succession is now less about swords and more about legal arguments dressed as scripture. The current debate: who has the right to rule if the previous monarch's will contradicts tradition? It sounds boring until armies start marching. You trail Emperor Charles IV as he attempts to impose a new set of succession laws within the Holy Roman Empire. His goal: stability. The result? Absolute chaos. His idea is elegant: designate an heir early. Confirm it with the electors. And bind it with church approval. But the nobles hate it. Especially the Wittelsbachs, who see this as an attempt to rig the future permanently. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs love the idea. They push it in their lands. They issue charters. They even start commissioning legal scholars to write treatises in their favor, complete with illustrations. One famous manuscript shows a king being handed a crown by angels, while a Wittelsbach prince is tripping over a pig. Subtle? No. Effective. Oh yes. The theological side heats up too. Some clerics argue that true kingship requires not just lineage, but moral authority, meaning anyone excommunicated, accused of heresy, or just kind of unpopular can be denied the throne. Guess which dynasty starts sending anonymous letters full of accusations? You guessed it. Everyone? Historians still argue whether this period represents the birth of modern statecraft or just medieval lawyering in funny hats. But what's undeniable inheritance has become a battlefield. You close your eyes and hear it. Not swords, not screams, but skrålsunderhållning. You squint through the smoke of a torchlit banquet hall in Luxembourg, where laughter drips like honey, but behind every toast, there's tension. The House of Luxembourg has entered the game. They aren't new. They've been dukes, bishops, and royal advisors for years. But now, with Charles IV, a Luxembourg wearing the imperial crown, the family is poised to become a third great dynasty beside the Habsburgs and Wittelsbachs. You watch Charles IV expand his family's reach, not by war, but by smart marriages and smarter appointments. His brothers are given prime territories. His sons are groomed like royal chess pieces. One gets Hungary. Another gets the Margraviate of Brandenburg. It's dynasty by deployment. But there's a cost. These new Luxembourg princes are often young, inexperienced, or worse, ambitious, without ability. One of them, Wenceslas, is already showing signs of trouble. Still, the strategy works for a while. The Wittelsbachs, reeling from Charles's earlier victories, try to block these moves through the imperial court. But Charles controls the court. He controls the Diet. And with Bohemia as his imperial anchor, he controls the conversation. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs are watching. Patient, quiet. They don't challenge Charles openly, but they begin courting his rivals. They support disgruntled nobles. They spread rumors Luxembourgs can't govern beyond their own kitchens. One pamphlet even mocks the emperor's love of architecture. He builds towers, not legacies. Historians still argue whether Charles was the last imperial mastermind or the first to build an empire on sand. You stand beneath one of his Gothic arches, beautifully empty, and realize the House of Luxembourg has peaked. The fall, it's coming. You sneak into a smoky council chamber in Vienna, where a Habsburg family meeting is going badly. Maps are torn. Voices raised. Someone slams a goblet of beer so hard it cracks. This isn't about politics, it's personal. Welcome to Austrian fratricide. The Habsburg dynasty, having regained strength under Duke Albert II and his successors, now finds itself trapped in its own success. Too much land, too many sons, not enough chairs at the dinner table. So they do what all sensible royal families do: divide the territories. In 1379, the Treaty of Neuburg splits the Habsburg lands between Albert's line and Leopold's line. Austria goes to one branch, Styria, Carinthia, and Tyrol to the other. On paper, logical. In practice, a disaster. Each line begins operating like its own petty kingdom. They issue separate edicts, build separate armies, and occasionally accuse each other of heresy just to spice things up. The Wittelsbachs, watching this chaos, pounce. They move to regain influence in imperial circles. They reach out to the Pope. They float a proposal to reunify their lands and whisper that maybe they should inherit Bohemia next time. One fringe moment, a Habsburg duke allegedly hires astrologers to prove that his branch is cosmically superior to his cousins. The result? A zodiac-based insult war that ends in an actual duel. The Luxembourgs, still on top, pretend not to notice, but cracks are forming everywhere. You realize now, succession isn't just about enemies. It's about brothers, cousins, nephews, all of whom want the same thing and think they deserve it more. The war isn't over land anymore. It's over legacy, and it's about to go nuclear. You stand in the grand hall of Prague Castle, where stained glass windows glow with saints and swords, and a group of very nervous nobles is deciding whether to light the fuse on their own kingdom. Bohemia, once the jewel of the empire, has grown restless. The Luxembourgs are distant. The Habsburgs meddle. The Wittelsbachs still whisper. And the Bohemian estates, they want control. So they start choosing sides. Some favor the Luxembourgs, for old time's sake. Others like the Wittelsbachs, especially their promises of lower taxes and regional autonomy. A smaller but vocal group pushes for Bohemian independence, a native king. Check only appointments. A rollback of foreign titles. And then it happens a faction of Bohemian nobles walks out of a royal council. They claim the current king, a half-hearted Luxembourg, has violated their traditional rights. They refuse to pay taxes. They raise troops. You hear the guards whisper at first, "Is this a rebellion?" One strange footnote. The rebels issue their own coins featuring a crowned lion flipping its tail at the imperial eagle. Subtle. The Luxembourgs try to calm things down. They send envoys. They offer pardons. They promise reforms. It doesn't work. The rebels, now dubbed the Free Estates. Dain? The Habsburgs see opportunity. They support the loyalists quietly at first. Then more boldly, they promise protection to nearby towns. They begin building fortifications closer to the Bohemian border. Historians still debate whether this was an organic protest or a calculated Habsburg ploy. What's certain is this Bohemia is no longer united. And once a kingdom fractures from within, the vultures start circling. You tiptoe through a velvet-curtained antechamber in the Hofburg Palace, where an imperial proclamation is being drafted. The quills scratch furiously. The language is flowery. The meaning, a direct violation of imperial protocol. The emperor, backed by the Luxembourgs, is about to override the electors and impose a royal decree. The topic, royal succession rights in Bohemia. The motive, panic. With Bohemian nobles rebelling and the Habsburgs maneuvering in the background, the emperor tries to reassert authority. He declares that only imperial families can be considered for the Bohemian crown. No, locals. No usurpers. The reaction? Outrage. The electors? Especially the Wittelsbachs. Cry foul. Since when can the emperor legislate succession without us? They ask loudly. Church leaders write scathing rebuttals. One even compares the emperor to Nebuchadnezzar, which is medieval speak for megalomaniac. The Habsburgs. They stay quiet, but not idle. Duke Albert IV begins sending troops to ensure stability. He posts guards near trade routes. He meets secretly with Bohemian loyalists who now fear the emperor more than the rebels. And then a surprise, a group of Bohemian nobles sends a delegation to Vienna. They don't want war, but they also don't want to be ruled by imperial fiat. They propose a deal limited autonomy in exchange for Habsburg support against the emperor. It's unofficial, dangerous, treason adjacent, and the Habsburgs accept. Historians still argue whether this moment was a turning point or a clever bluff. You sit beside the envoy as he writes the terms in secret. The ink blots slightly, just enough to leave a stain that history will never erase. You crouch in a cold tent in southern Moravia, listening to a Habsburg war council whisper through the smoke of a sputtering fire. Their hands trace maps. Their lips murmur prayers. Outside, snow crunches under boots. It's time for a comeback. The Habsburgs have been quiet, watching, plotting. But now, with the emperor overreaching and Bohemia divided, they make their move. They don't invade. They infiltrate. Over the next year, dozens of Bohemian towns begin spontaneously electing pro-Habsburg magistrates. Knights from Lower Austria begin appearing in markets. Trädfavorshift. And most effectively, a charm offensive. Habsburg agents arrive with grain, salt, and gold, all offered at discount rates to help our dear neighbors in their time of unrest. It works. One fringe detail, a Habsburg duke personally funds the rebuilding of a Bohemian monastery destroyed in the rebellion. The abbot thanks him in a sermon, And the next week, his entire district votes for Habsburg-backed reforms. Meanwhile, the Wittelsbachs try to counter. They promise alliances. They try to resurrect old claims, but they're too late. Their influence has curdled into nostalgia. The Luxembourgs still on the throne, but their grip weakens daily. Wenceslas, the new king, is charming but lazy. He drinks, he hunts, he forgets appointments. A Bohemian noble famously says, "Our king rides better than he rules." And you walk the narrow streets of Brno as a Habsburg soldier tips his helmet at a passing merchant. The crown isn't in Vienna yet, but it's moving. One Kiet promise. One wedding, one loaf of bread at a time. You stand once again in the echoing Cathedral of Prague. This time draped in black. The chandeliers are dark. The streets below are quiet. Charles IV is dead. The news spreads fast. Across cathedrals, castles, and counting houses. The death of the emperor is both a moment of mourning and a starting pistol. You follow the funeral procession. Cloaks drag across cobblestones. Priests chant. Nobles weep, some of them genuinely. And beside the coffin walks Wenceslas, Charles's son, who now wears 2 crowns but inspires exactly 0 confidence. Wenceslas is complicated. He loves poetry, and wine, and hawking, and not much else. He has no interest in managing the boiling empire his father left behind. Where Charles had vision, Wenceslas has hangovers. The Bohemian nobles, already tense from the prior power struggle, quickly realize their leash just got longer. The Wittelsbachs stir. They argue that Wenceslas, lazy as he is unfit to hold the imperial throne. They gather support to push for an alternative candidate, Rupert of the Palatinate. More on him soon. The Habsburgs, they stay unusually reserved. Perhaps because their preferred battleground, Bohemia, is already so tangled. Perhaps because they see a better opening ahead. One oddity, Wenceslas disappears for 2 weeks shortly after his coronation. Rumors swirl kidnapping, exile, illness. He was actually just drunk in a hunting lodge. Historians still debate if Charles IV's death marked the beginning of imperial decline or if things had been rotting for a while. But you know the truth. Wenceslas is king, but he isn't ruling. And kingdoms without captains, they drift into storms. You stumble through the corridors of a half-frozen palace in Frankfurt, where murmurs echo like ghosts. It's election season again, and Wenceslas is missing. Literally. The imperial electors are gathering, but the man wearing the crown is nowhere to be found. His absence speaks louder than a trumpet. So, the electors do something bold. Bizarre, and entirely within precedent, they depose him. And in his place, they elect Rupert of the Palatinate, a seasoned Wittelsbach with a decent reputation. Sharp political instincts. And unlike Wenceslas, the ability to stay awake through meetings, you ride alongside Rupert as he parades into cities with banners flying. People cheer not because they love him, but because they're exhausted by royal chaos. The empire needs someone who can read a ledger and carry a sword. Wenceslas, hearing of his deposition, doesn't raise an army, doesn't issue threats. He just shrugs. One quirky response. He reportedly told a friend, "I never liked the imperial title anyway. Too many rules." Still, the Luxembourgs are furious. Not because they love Wenceslas, but because the deposition is a threat to dynastic legitimacy. If electors can remove a king whenever he annoys them, what's the point of inheritance? The Habsburgs, they don't challenge the outcome. Not directly, but they begin courting Rupert's enemies. They extend their influence into imperial towns. They hold alternative diets, basically political shadow puppets, to undermine Rupert's decisions. Rupert tries to restore order. He travels constantly, holds court, punishes corruption. But the empire is a leaky ship, and his hands are cold. Historians still argue whether Rupert was a failed reformer or just an unlucky substitute teacher. You watch him stare out a frost-rimed window, fingers trembling. As another petition arrives, he's emperor. Yes, but the throne is beginning to splinter. You duck behind a toppled statue in a burning village square as civil war boils across imperial lands. The year is 1400-something, and every banner you see waves a different coat of arms, and all of them are ready to kill for it. Rupert's reign starts organized. But soon, noble, refuse order, cities, declare, neutrality. A handful of bishops form their own court and begin excommunicating anyone they don't like. Meanwhile, Wenceslas, officially deposed but unofficially still around, starts acting like a king again. He begins issuing charters, appointing judges, minting coins. Bohemia listens. Not because they love him, but because they hate everyone else more. And into this mess, the Habsburgs stride in. They begin quietly supporting both sides, depending on the region. In Austria, they back Rupert. In Bohemia, they flirt with Wenceslas. It's not duplicity. It's dynastic hedging. One memorable scene, a Habsburg envoy attends a feast hosted by a pro-Wenceslas baron while secretly carrying a sealed promise of troops to Rupert. When asked who he supports, the envoy simply toasts to the health of the empire. Meanwhile, cities like Nuremberg and Mainz turn into battlegrounds. Mercenaries change sides mid-fight. Even monasteries begin hoarding weapons. You watch as a monastery wall in Passau is reinforced with wagons and prayer books. One monk keeps. The Psalms work better when sung behind cover. Historians still argue whether this was a true civil war or just 100 overlapping bar fights with banners. But the effects are clear. The empire is bleeding. And the ones who survive are the ones who smile while sharpening knives. You cross the snow-choked mountain passes into Hungary, where another, Luxembourg, Sigismund, Charles IV's other son, is playing his own imperial long game. Sigismund is a strange mix-part schemer. Part knight, part philosopher. He marries into the Hungarian throne. He raises armies. He joins crusades. He builds alliances. And unlike his brother Wenceslas, he actually works. You follow him as he tries to salvage the Luxembourg name. His plan: restore order in the empire, secure Hungary, and eventually seize the imperial title himself. But nothing is easy. Bohemia is still rebellious. The Wittelsbachs still block him. The Habsburgs smile politely while grabbing border territories. Sigismund does what he can. Écoles councils, brokers peace, even proposes religious reform. One odd episode, Sigismund calls a synod to debate heresy. When one bishop protests the seating arrangement, Sigismund solves it by moving the chairs himself, then sitting in the middle and declaring, "Now we can argue properly." Meanwhile, he marries off nieces. Make vague promises. offer debt relief, and slowly, very slowly, begins assembling enough support to challenge for the imperial throne. But shadows gather. The Hussite movement is rising in Bohemia. Wenceslas, still technically king there, ignores the signs. Radical preachers are gaining power. The people are angry, hungry, armed. And Sigismund, he sees it coming. But he's not ready. Historians still argue whether Sigismund was a reformer ahead of his time, or just another tired son cleaning up his brother's mess. You watch him ride through a sleet storm toward Prague. He thinks he's going to restore order, but he's headed for a religious explosion. You huddle in the back pew of Bethlehem Chapel in Prague as a preacher with wildfire in his eyes declares that the church is corrupt, greedy, and ungodly, and that Bohemia will be free. Meet Jan Hus. His words spark the Hussite movement. A religious and political revolt wrapped in theology and patriotism. It's about corruption, yes, but it's also about Bohemian identity and defiance. Hus calls out simony, denounces indulgences, preaches in Czech, and his sermons hit harder than any sword. Sigismund, now heir to the imperial throne, tries to negotiate. He invites Hus to the Council of Constance with a safe conduct pass. Spoiler: Hus is arrested, tried, burned. Bohemia erupts. Hussite factions sites towns, burn monasteries, form military camps in forests. They march with banners of the chalice, symbol of communion for all. Sigismund, now crowned emperor, declares war, and thus begins the Hussite Wars, decades of brutal, chaotic, holy war. The Habsburgs side with Sigismund. So do the Wittelsbachs. But inside Bohemia, no one is safe. You crouch behind a siege wall as peasants chant hymns and catapults launch Bible pages soaked in pitch. One town declares itself the New Jerusalem and sets fire to every tax record it can find. Historians still argue whether the Hussite Wars were an early Reformation or just a civil collapse. But you know one thing for sure, the crown of Bohemia now lies in flames. You crouch under the shattered dome of Kutna Hora, where silver dust still clings to the air, and cannon fire echoes off ruined chapels. Welcome to the Hussite Wars. Year 5. What began as outrage over Jan Hus's execution has transformed into a full-blown ideological revolution. Bohemia now bleeds along theological lines. There are ultraquists moderates who want church reform and communion in both kinds, and Taborites radicals who want to level society itself, property, hierarchy, even monarchs all on the chopping block. Sigismund, now Holy Roman Emperor, leads crusades into Bohemia, often backed by the Habsburgs, eager to stabilize the region and maybe grab a crown or two while they're at it. But the Hussites fight differently. No armored knights, no Latin chants, just wagons, crossbows, and songs in Czech. Their general, Jan I Ka, is blind in one eye and later in both, but undefeated. One strange weapon flails. Repurposed farming tools turned into spinning death machines. The Habsburgs suffer embarrassing defeats. Sigismund's armies retreat again and again. Even when Prague is temporarily taken, the Hussites simply regroup and retake it with holy fury. By 1434, moderate factions prevail over radicals, but the land is broken. Monasteries are burned. Nobility is shattered. And yet, Bohemia still stands. Historians still argue whether the Hussites were proto-Protestants or political pragmatists. But you sit beside a peasant in Tabor, stirring soup with a pike handle. And, you know, they didn't fight to win. They fought to be heard. You walk the blood-streaked hall of a crumbling castle near Olomouc, where a strange peace settles like fog. The Hussite wars are winding down not with victory, but with compromise. Sigismund finally negotiates with the moderate Hussites. In 1436, he's crowned King of Bohemia years after trying to burn it down. His rule is hollow, distrusted, but official. The radicals are gone. The cities still smolder. Bohemia is tired. The Habsburgs, meanwhile, have been waiting. They played both sides supporting Sigismund, then secretly corresponding with rebel lords. Now they begin re-establishing trade links, securing castles, and renewing marriage alliances. It's not conquest. It's colonization by diplomacy. Sigismund, dies in 1437, and with no male heirs. His son-in-law, an Austrian duke named Albert of Habsburg, inherits the Bohemian crown. Boom! The Habsburgs have entered Bohemia, not with swords, but with silk. You watch the coronation? It's tense. Some Hussites walk out, but the nobles, exhausted, accept it. Albert promises religious tolerance, economic stability, and, crucially, he doesn't speak. Czech, so he can't argue too much. One funny detail during Albert's short reign. He tries to standardize coinage and accidentally triggers a silver strike. Peasants bury their money in protest. Still, for the first time in generations, Bohemia is ruled by a Habsburg king. Historians still debate whether this was a peaceful succession or opportunistic occupation. But you walk the corridors of Prague Castle and hear Habsburg boots echoing, and the crown, it fits. Almost. You blink through a funeral procession in Vienna as Albert II of Habsburg is lowered into the crypt. He ruled Bohemia, Hungary, and the empire for just 2 years. He dies in 1439. Suddenly, of dysentery or divine irony, his heir, unborn. Literally. His wife, Elizabeth of Luxembourg, is pregnant. The dynasties hold their breath. And then, like a scene from a holy manuscript, a boy is born, Ladislas the Posthumous. He's crowned in theory, but raised under guardianship. And that's when everything unravels. Bohemia splinters again. Some nobles want a native king. Others support baby Ladislas. Others want a Polish prince. Hungary revolts. The empire hesitates. It's like a royal Sudoku. Only every square is on fire. The Wittelsbachs try to return. They propose candidates. They send envoys. But their support has thinned. Too many losses. Too much time. The Habsburgs fight to preserve Ladislas's claim. They install regents. They bribe bishops. They raise armies not to conquer, but to stall. One quirky episode. In 1452, the regent Ulrich of Chile is assassinated during breakfast by a rival noble using a meat skewer. Nobody finishes the eggs. Eventually, Ladislas comes of age, but he's sickly, shy, and controlled by courtiers. He dies young, possibly poisoned, leaving no heirs. the crown wobbles again. Historians still argue whether this period was royal chaos or just medieval standard procedure, but one thing is clear. Succession is no longer about who rules. It's about who survives long enough to sit down. You warm your hands beside a Bohemian hearth as peasants gossip about the next king. One says he's Polish. Another says he's Hungarian. A third says he's already here in disguise. They're all kind of right. After Ladislaus's death, Bohemia elects George of Pod, Brady a Czech noble, moderate Hussite, and surprisingly competent politician. He's not a Habsburg. He's not a Wittelsbach. He's a local boy. And he holds it together. Barely. The Pope excommunicates him. The Empire ignores him. But he negotiates treaties, reforms taxation, and even proposes a pan-European peace league 400 years before the EU. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs plot. They marry. They petition. They whisper. Their champion, Vladislaus II, a Jagiellonian prince from Poland with a distant claim. In 1471, after George's death, Bohemia elects Vladislaus, a Jagiellon, not a Habsburg, but not a disaster. Still, the Habsburgs don't sulk. They wait. One clever tactic. They stop contesting the crown directly and instead marry into every branch of the Jagiellonian tree. By 1500, they've basically in-lawed their way into half the dynasty. You watch as portraits of Habsburgs and Jagiellons start to blur together. And though the crown isn't yet on a Habsburg head, it's already in a Habsburg dowry chest. You step into the vaulted hall of Maximilian I Brief, a Habsburg emperor who doesn't kick down doors, he marries through them. His motto, "Let others wage war thou. Happy Austria. Marry." And it works. Maximilian marries Mary of Burgundy, gaining first northern territories. Then he arranges for his son Philip the Handsome to marry Joanna of Castile, dragging Spain into the mix. Their son, Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Europe. But back to Bohemia. When King Vladislaus II dies, the Bohemian crown passes to his son Louis II. Young, overpromised, and already surrounded by Habsburg uncles. One memorable moment at a royal hunt. A Habsburg cousin gives Louis II a golden dagger inscribed with "In unity." Strength. The blade's hilt bears the imperial eagle. Subtle. But fate intervenes. In 1526, Louis II dies at the Battle of Mohacs, crushed by Ottoman forces in Hungary. No heir, no plan, and right on cue. Ferdinand of Habsburg-Louis's brother-in-law claims the Bohemian throne. The nobles hesitate, then agree. The Habsburgs have finally done it. No Siege. No rebellion. Just patience. And a couple very strategic weddings. Let's conclude your bedtime history epic with the final sections 26-30. Followed by the wind-down to lull your listeners into deep historical dreams. From Ferdinand's coronation to the quiet, patient triumph of the Habsburgs. The endgame unfolds. You're back in the candlelit Cathedral of Prague. Only now the incense smells more like finality than hope. Ferdinand I of Habsburg is being crowned king, not with fanfare, but with negotiation. After Louis II's death at Mohacs in 1526, Bohemia is terrified. The Ottomans are coming. Hungary is crumbling, and someone needs to take the wheel. Ferdinand steps in, backed by family, faith, and fortune. He's already Archduke of Austria, married to Louis's sister, and beloved by the Habsburg PR machine. The Bohemian nobles are skeptical. He's a foreigner, a Catholic, but he promises to uphold local laws, protect their privileges, and most importantly, defend them against the Turks. They nod. They vote. And just like that, the Bohemian crown becomes a Habsburg heirloom. One curious clause: Ferdinand agrees to consult the Bohemian estates before raising taxes or sending troops abroad. It sounds noble. It will not last. Still, for now, peace. Historians still argue whether this was a lawful succession or a royal hijacking. But you watch as Ferdinand sits stiffly on the throne, eyes scanning the stone vaults. He knows this isn't conquest. It's custody. And he's here to make it permanent. You shuffle through stacks of legal scrolls in Vienna, where Ferdinand I is slowly turning promise into policy and policy into power consolidation. His reign is calm on the surface, but under the table, he's rewriting the rules. First, he strengthens imperial administration. More officials, better records, less reliance on noble whims. Second, he centralizes the army. No more feudal levies. He wants a real, professional force funded not by nobles, but by taxes. Third, he begins quietly reducing Bohemia's autonomy, piece by piece. The nobles notice. They complain. He smiles and ignores them. One infamous moment, a Czech noble protests new land taxes by citing the original coronation oath. Ferdinand allegedly replies, "Oaths fade. Obligations grow." Subtle. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation spreads Bohemia, with its Hussite past, leans toward reform. Ferdinand tries to contain it, tolerant in public, restrictive in policy. Churches are monitored. Preachers watched. The Wittelsbachs? Still around. But politically marginal. The empire has changed. And they missed the train. The Habsburgs now dominate Austria. Hungary, Bohemia, and the imperial title itself. You exhale because the war is over. Not with a bang, but with a filing cabinet. You sit in a quiet monastery garden in Olomouc, where Ferdinand's heir, Maximilian II, strolls among the roses, trying to decide whether to crush Protestantism or understand it. Maximilian is a reform-minded Habsburg, raised in the Renaissance, friendly with Lutherans, fond of big ideas and small compromises. He's crowned King of Bohemia in 1562 with little resistance. The nobles sigh in relief. A Habsburg who listens. Maybe Maximilian allows limited religious freedom, invites scholars to court, and resists the urge to purge. His policies stabilize Bohemia, for now. But he faces pressure from both sides. Protestants want more rights. The Pope wants fewer. His advisors warn him mildness breeds dissent. He ignores them. One fringe detail: Maximilian reportedly kept a secret room filled with books banned by the Inquisition, including Husse Samunds. Historians still argue whether Maximilian was naive or brilliantly cautious. You watch him debate scripture with a Hussite professor under an elm tree. The crown sits beside him, Not heavy, not light, but still very much his. You march past solemn cathedrals and silent battlefields as tensions return slowly. Then suddenly, by the late 16th century, Bohemia is divided again. Catholic loyalists versus, quote, Protestantistat. The Habsburgs grow less tolerant. The Protestants grow bolder. In 1617, Ferdinand II, a devout Catholic, is crowned King of Bohemia. The nobles tolerate it until he starts shutting churches. Then, they explode. On May 23, 1618, in the royal castle in Prague, angry Protestant nobles throw 2 Habsburg governors and a secretary out a third-story window. The defenestration of Prague. They survive. The war begins. You're now in the 30 Years' War, and Bohemia lights the match. The nobles elect a Protestant king. The Habsburgs invade. The Battle of White Mountain crushes the rebellion in 1620. Bohemia loses its autonomy. Nobles are executed. Protestantism is outlawed. Habsburg rule becomes absolute. Historians still argue if this was religious war or political overreach. You walk the silent square where noble heads once lined spikes. Bohemia is now Habsburg ground. For centuries, you float through the chandelier-lit halls of Schönbrunn, where portraits of emperors line the walls, some stern, some smug. All Habsburg. Bohemia is no longer a kingdom. It's a province, a memory, a crown locked in a velvet case for 300 years. The Habsburgs rule it with iron, etiquette, and bureaucratic weight. The Wittelsbachs fade into regional relevance. The Luxembourgs dissolve into history. But the scars remain. Language shifts. Rights diminish. The nobility fragments. By the 18th century, Bohemia becomes a loyal but quiet corner of an empire it once shaped. You visit Prague again, its churches rebuilt, its windows intact. Y voici qui était. Historians still argue what Bohemia's wars of succession mean. A fight for power. Identity, faith, maybe all of it. You run your fingers along the edge of a forgotten coronation throne. And you understand, sometimes empires win not by conquering. So now, just breathe. Let the clang of armor and the clatter of parchments fade. Let the weight of crowns, the clamor of courts, and the sting of betrayal melt away into silence. You've wandered centuries tonight, through halls and battlefields, monasteries and dungeons. You've listened to kings whisper, noble plot, and empires quietly shift on creaking wooden thrones. Now it's time to rest. Imagine you're walking through the forests outside Prague. The leaves rustle above. The stars are barely visible behind low mist. You hear nothing but your own footsteps and the wind brushing past stone towers. Worn down by time, Bohemia sleeps. The Habsburgs rule still for now. But even dynasties fodder. Even empires theme. And what remains? Not the crowns, not the seals, but the stories. Yours now, tucked away behind your eyelids as you slip deeper into stillness. Let history rest beside you tonight.